I'm Emir Crowne. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. It's a political document, it's a liberal document. And I think that if we had more input from traditionally disadvantaged groups, I mean, like homeless, that's a group I can almost guarantee you had no input in the charter. But now those are clearly emerging rights in terms of shelter, food, and so on. So I think if we reached out to more disadvantaged groups and looked at what even other countries are doing in relation to their rights, like India, South Africa, and so on, how their constitutions have evolved and so on, then that would give us too a better idea of these sort of rights that we sort of take for granted, right? This idea of a right to shelter and so on. So I think that would be sort of the approach. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the first point for the charter is it's always hailed and it's taught as this sort of, this great achievement in sort of Canadian law generally. And I mean, I don't want to take away from the achievements of the charter, but I think that there are rights in the charter there that could have been included even 30 years ago. They aren't things that people, like that they're new fashioned rights that now emerge. I think there are certain rights, like I think the right to education, for instance. That could be a right that could be included. A right to food is one that could arguably be included. Right to shelter, right to health care, so on. There are these rights that I think they're missing from the charter. And I think that they're missing because at its root, the charter is a liberal document, right? It's a document that, by virtue of 32.1, it only applies to governments, federal, provincial governments, because the whole idea is that the state somehow keeps encroaching on the liberty of private individuals. So it really only applies to state intrusions. And sort of from that liberal backdrop is the idea that, in my view, that all the charter did really was sort of encapsulate rights, freedoms, values that white middle class Canadians enjoyed. That's fundamentally what the charter was fundamentally concerned with protecting. Because if you think about the rights I sort of enumerated, a right to food, a right to shelter, right? Things like that are non-issues, right, for middle class Canadians. And so the idea that this charter is supposed to represent sort of this consensus building idea of what we all as Canadians agree to, I sort of take issue with that. I take issue with the fact that there are things there, a lot of social and economic rights that are excluded from the charter. And those rights are even reflected in international conventions, but not necessarily in our charter. Like the right to food, for instance, Indian Supreme Court dealt with the right to food issue, and they said that the right to food, it's clearly a human right, a universal right, and they sort of they protected that right under their constitution by virtue of an extension of the right to life. So they said as an element of a right to life, right to food is an element of that. Even if there are gaps, because no legislation is perfect, how do we deal with that? I think that's where the Supreme Court and other courts have taken certain sections of the Charter and sort of realized that, this idea that the Charter is a living tree and this sort of dialogue between the judiciary and the legislature. So, in my view, despite those shortcomings and despite those criticisms, that the Section 7 jurisprudence and the Section 15 jurisprudence are the ones where I think there's most hope. Most hope for sort of bridging this gap. So the Section 7 on the right to life, liberty, security of the person, and Section 15 on equality rights, I think that's where we've seen a lot of growth in that area to the point where, like in Chauli, 2005, the Supreme Court basically said that there is a right to health care, a right to health, and it's sort of like a soft right under that umbrella of the Section 7 right to life. Right? So that would be one example where we have the existing charter rights, and even though I've said there are defects, the Supreme Court has sort of recognized, well, if the charter is supposed to be an evolving document, then maybe we could protect things like the right to health. And then BC Court of Appeal, the City of Victoria and Adams. So that's the case where there was basically a right to shelter. BC's Court of Appeal said that as part again of the Section 7 rights, this idea that all of them really are engaged, life, liberty, and security of the person. If you don't have adequate shelter, all of those interests are triggered. And so they sort of fashioned a remedy for people living in tents and parks and so on, and said that the right to shelter is a fundamental element of Section 7 rights. So that to me shows some sort of promise in the Charter, despite, like I said, the certain gaps. Right, yeah, and in India, they talk about a right to life. And so the Indian Supreme Court has interpreted that right to life, which is our Section 7, part of our Section 7, as including the right to food. Because, I mean, but for food, really the right is an empty right, because, you know, you wouldn't be alive. So that's sort of the basis, and it is precisely that. It's an entirely analogous situation. So that if ever we were to deal with a right to food, seems to me that answer is, at least by analogy, is very well settled.